So for the rest of that journey, that was every day. It was like literally almost every, moment. I was just saying, just do your best. Don't worry when you get knocked down. Just get up, do your best. When you're having a really bad day, whether it's in the office or whether it's in the middle of your 3-year bike ride, and you think, what am I doing? Why don't I just fly home? Never quit on that day, because that's the wrong day to quit. The day to quit is when you've just had a beautiful day of cycling or you've just had a great day at work and then think, is it time to do something else? When I was in Australia, I'd been going for a year and a half. I think I was still further away from home than when I started. Then you have those questions of what on earth am I doing with my life? And you have to push through those times.
Welcome to Before We Get There, the podcast where we explore people's journeys, how they got to where they are, what keeps them pushing forward, and where they eventually want to get to. I'm your host, Nicholas Braman, and today I'm joined by Rob Lilwall. Rob is a professional adventurer, author of 2 books, and motivational speaker. We discussed his first big trip of 3 years, cycling from Siberia all the way back to London via Southeast Asia and Australia, as well as the various motivations and challenges he had, his struggles with shyness, the lessons learned from his expeditions, and much more. Enjoy the show. Hi, Rob. Great to see you.
Great to see you.
It's great to have you on. And first of all, I wanted to say I just finished reading your book, which was amazing. So really appreciate getting to hear all about your adventures. And I think where I'd like to start, obviously I don't want to recap the whole book and go through it, but just to give people a sense of how you started this journey in your 20s. So you had a friend who was biking around the world and he invited you to join him, and then you just flew off to Siberia in the middle of nowhere, right?
Yeah, I'd say there's sort of several levels of explanation. And it's interesting. I think the older I've got, because that journey it's 20 years ago since I started it. And I think at the time, that is basically what happened. I was a high school teacher in the UK. I had a little bit of an adventurous spirit. I'd done a few adventures at university, but then I'd ended up going in a very conventional path, partly because I just thought I ought to be conventional. But I wasn't doing great as a teacher. I was quite a young teacher in England. The kids misbehaved a lot. I was struggling a bit. And then this old friend who I'd done some adventures with at uni, he'd gone off and he was cycling all around the world. He said, why don't you come and meet me on the eastern side of Asia? We'll ride back to England together. It'll be a great adventure. And he basically gave me the if not now, then when argument. And I said yes, flew off to meet him. And then this adventure turned into a much bigger adventure than I'd planned. But I'd say underneath that sort of surface story, there were various other things which were probably driving me to it. So there's different levels of explanation, as there always are.
So what were some of those other layers?
Okay, yeah. So we're diving right in there. I'd say, because recently I've been writing a 3rd book. Actually, I've been writing it for years now, part-time writing, where I've been talking about a much more recent expedition. And as I've done that, it's turned into a bit of a memoir where I've been reflecting back on why I started my adventures. So that's the journey I've been on. I've read through like 1 million words of my old diaries and journals to try and understand who was this young guy who went off to Siberia 20 years ago. And I think a big part of it was I was very insecure, as a lot of young people are. And I was very shy as a teenager. And I think that as a teenager, I was really unhappy with my shyness. I was that kid in the class who never put his hand up, couldn't do public speaking at all, any of that. And I think I carried that into university, and I was always fine with friends. I was fine on a sort of small group basis, but was very shy in bigger social situations. And I had this burning desire to overcome that fear and that insecurity I knew inside myself. And I think in a way, going on this big bike trip, it was a sort of chance to take on a big challenge and face my fears. And I think I've always found challenge. What draws me to challenge is the hope of transformation. It's a sort of almost subconscious belief that if I can overcome this challenge, if I can face that fear, then it will transform me somehow. So I think that was really much driving me deep down. And so I met my friend Al. We ended up starting in Siberia, as the title of the book is Cycling Home from Siberia States. And we ended up with this brutal first 3 months in Siberia with way beyond my comfort zone. It was really my friend Al, who was much braver than me, who had that can-do mindset, which powered us into Siberia. We camped at -40. We got robbed. All these other sort of crazy things happened. And we got to Japan, this was about 3 months after we started. And then shortly after that, we split up, and and it then took me almost 3 more years, about 32 months to cycle home from Japan to England. But we split up. So I did most of it alone. And I think what was going on there, that the reason we split up was partly we had cabin fever. We'd been stuck together for a long time in Siberia. We needed a break. Wasn't really the reason, because we were still good friends. Secondly, I think I realized I needed to make the route more challenging, because after Siberia, it was looking quite easy, just cycling through China and Central Asia. So I decided to do a big detour. But biggest of all is I decided I had to go on alone, because when I was with Al, he was always being the brave one. I was hiding behind him a bit. So then I had to face this line. So the rest of the journey, I kept on setting myself these challenges. And in hindsight, I realized now I was wanting to challenge myself because I desperately wanted to change, essentially.
You say that very casually. Oh, yeah, it was too easy just cycling across the whole 2 continents of Europe and Asia back to the UK. It doesn't sound very easy to most of us. But going back to, you mentioned being shy and not comfortable with public speaking. How about just when you were teaching before you started on this expedition? Was that a challenge you had to overcome then?
Yeah, it was. So I think that was maybe one of the reasons I sort of went in for teaching. It was again, it was trying to face that fear through transformation, to transform through fear. And that in a classroom, you're just throwing in, you're in charge, you have to speak. So I think that sort of forced me to start doing that. But it didn't really change me in terms of outside of the classroom, feeling any more confident about myself. I suppose I just had very low kind of confidence, very low belief in what I could do. So yeah, you're picking up on an interesting theme there. That I think there was a similar force maybe drove me to the classroom, but then I felt I needed to do something different, face fears in a different way.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think I'm similar. I have anxiety about public speaking, and I'm always the quiet one in the room and much more comfortable in small groups than in large groups. And I also did some English as a second language teaching, and of course, getting into the corporate life, giving presentations and meetings and that sort of thing. And I've spoken a couple times in business conferences and that sort of thing. But one thing I'm curious, do you feel like you have a persona that you put on, whether it's in front of the classroom or other types of speaking, or maybe at first, especially when you first started, okay, this is the normal Rob every day. And okay, now it's time to get in front of my students in the classroom. I need to put on my speaking voice, and energy and personality shifts a bit, or is it just all the same?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, Nicholas. I don't think it's like an intentional thing where I'm like, okay, going into public speaking mode. I suppose it's just, for me, I find the hardest context to ask to public speak is putting your hand up at the end of a lecture. If somebody's giving a lecture or a presentation, put your hand up and ask a question. That I've always found hardest, because you're not really expected to speak. I find it's easier to, let's say, sign up to be the speaker, or now my job is to be the speaker. So I'm expected. And once you get pushed onto that stage, you've got no choice. You've got to speak. Once you get pushed into that classroom, you've got to speak. And so that's easier. You've got no choice except to speak, unless you just literally have a meltdown, which has never happened to me, thankfully. So I find it's that decision before you get on stage, that decision to put yourself in the arena. That's where the courage comes. And then once you're on, you just have to go for it. And I once heard some great advice from Marshall Goldsmith, who's this quite big, very big American speaker coach. And he was speaking at an event I was at in Mumbai, I think it was. And I asked him afterwards, like, how do you go up there and speak again and again? He just always says, when I'm getting ready to speak, maybe sometimes, I guess if there's a hesitation, I just say, it's showtime. It's showtime. Let's stop worrying about myself. I'm going to go out and say it's showtime. And I think that's great. I always say that now before I go on stage. It's showtime. Stop worrying about yourself. Go up and have some fun. And I think that's really helpful.
Cool. That's great advice. And one thing that I found out through reading the book that I didn't realize when I first heard you speak is that you were actually started giving lectures while you were on this expedition, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it was partly financial. So it was a 3-year journey. I had a life savings of around about $15,000 US, so about $5,000 a year, which isn't a lot of money to live for 3 years. I had to live in a tent. I had to eat cheap food. I should just nuance that and say that there's 2 billion people in the world who live on much less money than that. So it wasn't exactly hardship. It just feels hard for somebody from a rich country. But it was quite tight budget wise. And so to earn extra money, and I guess also to give myself one of these extra challenges, I emailed international schools along my route. And I said, I'm cycling through Seoul or Shanghai or Hong Kong or wherever I was about to arrive. Do you want me to come and give an assembly to your kids at the school about my learning about the world? And of course, a lot of schools, I think the schools with the best kind of head teachers or whatever said, oh, that would be great for our kids. And they invited in and they gave me like $100 or $200, which would keep me going another week. And it was also a great experience. It gave me that experience of speaking to bigger groups, which I hadn't done before.
And how did you come up with that idea? And was it difficult to ask to get paid at that point? Or did they offer to pay you and they accepted?
Yeah, the idea was actually Al's idea. My friend I went through Siberia, he had been cycling before we met in Russia. He had been cycling through Africa and America. And I think he had just accidentally discovered this idea where he was, I think a friend of a friend was a teacher and they said, oh, when you come through Cairo or wherever it was, come and give a talk. And he did it and they gave him $100 or something. And he was, oh, this is quite a good way to meet people, get paid a little bit and engage with the local community. So he did that. And so I followed up on his idea from Japan onwards. And this was like I say, 20 years ago. I'd just literally Google the schools in Shanghai, all the international schools, send them all an email, and you'd get 1 or 2 bites usually in each city. And the pay, yeah, I think I started off just maybe saying, give me something towards my bike ride if you want. And then maybe I said, oh, $100 would be appreciated, which for a big international school is not very much money.
Yeah. One thing I think it's pretty unusual because we almost crossed paths. I think I actually lived in Jilin province in northeastern China for a year in 2005 to 2006.
Oh, wow.
2003 to 2004.
Okay.
Not nearly as adventurous as yours. It's a crazy story. There was this Chinese businessman who started a kung fu school in the middle of nowhere. There was a lake near where we were that was frozen from October to April or May, frozen solid enough people were driving cars and starting campfires and stuff out on it. But I somehow, after I graduated high school, I took a year off and did some backpacking and ended up living in this. There's no reason for the school to be there. There's no history of martial arts in that part of China. And he just was this entrepreneurial sort of guy who had a website up at that time pretty early on, as far as this kind of things go. And so there were people from all over the world, Australia, UK, South Africa, Dubai, who wanted to learn martial arts. It wasn't very useful in the end, I know now, after continuing to study martial arts for a while, but it was very interesting. But I think you didn't go through that part of China because you went to Japan and then came back over through Korea. But I have a little bit of an idea of that kind of temperature and what the climate is and out there. So I thought that was fun to read about.
And what a great, it's great to go off and have these adventures, I think, when you're either after uni or after school. It's so, even if you didn't learn the best martial arts, just the experience of going out there is such a great thing. Yeah, I've never been to northern China. So I arrived in Tianjin on a ferry from Seoul when I came over into China the first time in early 2005 is when I arrived. I guess I was in Siberia just above you in 2004 when you were there.
Yeah. It's just looking at the timelines of your trip. It's incredible that you were 3 years on the road and away from everybody. And that's another thing I wanted to ask you about on the trip that you mentioned earlier, but I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into it, is that you didn't just, again, ride back to the UK from Siberia, but you actually went all through Southeast Asia to Philippines, Papua New Guinea, and then rode around Australia before coming back up through Singapore. And I was just curious about because I don't think you were chasing a record or anything like that, but it's not a direct route. So what was the thought process? And I think you mentioned in the book a couple times in Australia, you were feeling maybe a little bit questioning your decision to go this route.
Yeah. So I think it was probably a few things. I think it was partly like my only real agenda on the trip was to try and cycle all the way home, start a long way from home, finish at home. And then the sort of subheading to that was by the most interesting route I could think of. So I was just following my nose. And I find the best adventures you have are usually not the ones you think, is this going to be a good story? What's going to look good? That's a terrible reason to adventure. It's just good when you just think, oh, I'd love to try and get to there. That's a great challenge. That sort of sense of challenge. And the idea of trying to get from mainland Asia, from like Hong Kong down to Australia. And I'd never been to Australia. So that just really captured me as a challenge. And to do that, my plan, I wasn't going to fly. That felt a bit like cheating to the whole route I was trying to do without flying. And so I would have to hitchhike on boats from, like you say, I went from Hong Kong, I got a boat to the Philippines, then to Indonesia, then to Papua New Guinea, island hop, having to like network with loads of people to find boats, sleep on cargo ships, on yachts, all these different things. And that was as a shy person, that was a big challenge for me, just to get out there and ask for help to find a boat. So that, I think it was that sort of needing to grow the challenge. Though you're also right that I think when I was in Australia, I'd been going for a year and a half. I think I was still further away from home than when I started. Then you have those questions of what on earth am I doing with my life? And you have to push through those times. One of the things my friend Al said to me in Siberia, which I think is great advice, is never quit on a bad day. So when you're having a really bad day, whether it's in the office or whether it's in the middle of your 3-year bike ride, and you think, what am I doing? Why don't I just fly home? Never quit on that day, because that's the wrong day to quit. The day to quit is when you've just had a beautiful day of cycling or you've just had a great day at work and then think, is it time to do something else? Because sometimes it is, but that's a good time to make that decision, not on the bad day.
Another question I have, probably the last question about the trip, is I feel like, and again, it's easy from a third-party perspective, bird's eye view, looking back and sitting in my comfortable air-conditioned room and like reading about your adventures. But I would think, just theorizing, that on this kind of expedition, you get into a routine that makes things a little bit easier. You get used to the setting up your tent and cooking your dinner and finding a place to sleep. And not always easy. You had tons of adventures and misadventures that you share in the book. But what do you think about, because a lot of people talk about getting in the zone as far as playing sports or performing or creating art or writing and that sort of thing. But what do you think longer term in the zone? Were there periods of your expedition where you're like smooth sailing, this is the routine, I'm making a lot of progress, and then sometimes you'd have bigger challenges that you'd have to deal with at certain points?
Yeah, I think on one sense, a bike ride is a bit like go on a big 3-year bike ride. It's a bit like starting a new job. The first week on a new job, it's scary as hell. You don't know what's going on. You're worried what everybody thinks of you. And after a few weeks, you're still a little bit nervous going to work. After 6 months, you just turn up at work. You know what you're doing. You know, you roll with what's going up and down. And then you have the occasional more dramatic day or whatever. But it's a bit like that. At the beginning of a big bike ride, it's all new. It's all scary. I did very much start in the deep end with Siberia and winter. But then after a few months, your body has become very fit. So you don't really notice the physical challenge gets a lot easier after a few months. Your body just gets used to cycling every day. You know how to put a tent up with your eyes closed. You can cook everything becomes quite easy. So in one sense, you do get into these routines. On another sense, there are constant mini dramas on a bike trip, just like there are in life. So it might be you get a puncture or you get lost or there's a massive thunderstorm. And these little setbacks come constantly. And then sometimes you have your bigger setbacks where you get robbed or you catch malaria or you decide to go through you decide to go through Afghanistan. It's like really scary. Even the whole 3 months building up to that, you're thinking about it all the time. So it's a mixture of a whole load of different things. And in my motivational speeches I do now, as you've seen, there are 2 words I lean into quite a lot. One is resilience, which is the ability to bounce back when you're knocked over, which happens all the time on a bike trip. You have some kind of, whether it's a psychological or a physical setback, and you just have to get back up and keep going. And the other is agility, and that's a bit more forward-looking, bouncing forwards, adapting to new situations, being prepared to change the plan according to how the environment is changing or the situation changes, make the most of a new opportunity. So that resilience and agility were 2 things. I didn't use those words when I was on the trip. I think those were 2 deeper traits that I was really growing in during the journey, which basically make the difference between failure and success.
Yeah, some of the challenges that you went through are really incredible. I can't imagine. So now I want to jump forward after this 3-year trip and you get home because, for example, when I lived in China the second time, it was for about 2 years, and I was in Shanghai. And I was still young at that time. I was 22, around 21, 22, and was just doing my thing, living a life in Shanghai and off on my own in this huge, gigantic, fast-moving country. And eventually it came time to move back home. And I felt, first of all, a huge amount of reverse culture shock moving back to Seattle, where I grew up, just because it was so different. But then I think there was a bigger sense of loss, that this cool life that I had in a faraway place, a super exotic place for me at that time, it was a lot different back in the early 2000s than it is now. And then going back to the same grocery store I did when I was younger, in my younger days, driving the same roads. And I think for you, that could have been even bigger. Did you have that sense of culture shock or readjustment period after you got back to the UK?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it was partly culture shock of being back in my own country after living, like you say, going through all these quite exotic places. And it was also, I suppose it was interestingly, I think when I got back from that 3-year bike ride, I had grown up a bit. I was 30 when I got back. I had grown in the kind of can-do mindset, in many ways, what the psychologists would call a growth mindset, which is belief in your ability to learn new things, to be able to adapt, to learn through failure. I'd really developed in that. But I think a growth mindset, it can be quite compartmentalized in our lives. So we can be like, I had a really great growth mindset for bicycle expeditions. So if you'd said to me, go and cycle across this country, I think almost any country in the world, I said, yeah, I can probably figure that out. But when it came back to England, when I got to England, back to my own culture, it was like, I didn't really believe I could do anything else apart from what I'd done before. I thought I could only really be a high school teacher because that was the only thing I qualified at. I had this very kind of fixed mindset about what I could do. And maybe some of the people who knew me were still putting me in that box. So that probably didn't help. And so I started applying for teaching jobs and I felt very lost. I'm a natural sort of bit of a self-doubter, a questioner. And so I was thinking, what have you been doing for 3 years? Everyone else is settling down, getting mortgages. You've just been off. What an idiot. I thought about myself on a bad day. And I actually did go interview for 2 teaching jobs and I didn't get them. But at the same time, there were a few lucky breaks I had. And I think that's the other thing is when we push ourselves out of our comfort zone, whether it's going off teaching in Shanghai, going off on a bike ride, by getting out of your comfort zone, often new opportunities will come along. There are often unexpected rewards for showing courage in your life, and they will come along in unexpected ways. And of course, there's luck involved, but I think you increase the chances of unexpected luck, unexpected rewards if you get out of your comfort zone lots. And so I had some very lucky breaks. First of all, a publisher read my blog, and back in those days, there was no social media. Social media was just getting going. But I'd just written a monthly blog, which about 100 people read, friends and family. And somebody I know forwarded the blog to a friend who worked for a publisher. She read it and she really liked it. And she said, send us a book proposal. And so I got a book deal, which was very unexpected. And I think if you had said to me, you've got to write a book or go and knock on the door of publishers and tell them you want to write a book, I wasn't brave enough for that. But when somebody actually invited me to write one, I could say, yes, I'll do that. And so I started writing the first book. And then another very lucky kind of thing that happened was I was cycling through Europe just before I got home. And I was giving these talks in the schools. And at the end of one talk, a kid put her hand up and said, what will you do with your video footage? Because I'd been showing a few clips in my talks because I'd been self-filming it. I had a video camcorder. I was just in a very amateur way, filming it for fun as I went. And I said, when she asked me in this talk, I said, I won't do anything. I'm just filming it for fun. Again, I didn't have the guts to even think about doing anything with that footage. And she went home, told her dad, and dad sent me an email. And he said, he was a very senior leader at National Geographic channels. And he said, we'd love to see your footage. My daughter said it's a good trip. And they took the footage and made it into this quite fun TV show. So that kind of changed much. And I also gave talks in the UK in schools while I was writing my first book to earn money. So that gave me a lot more experience at giving talks in a sort of more Western context. And then to jump forward a little bit, that sort of turned me from being a teacher into this sort of potential professional adventurer. I'd done an adventure. I'd made a bit of a living out of it. And that kind of led me on to thinking about doing new expeditions. And that sort of led me into this career I've ended up doing now.
That's really amazing. Yeah, there's a quote, I can't think of the whole thing now, but about luck happens, but you have to be ready for it, and you have to be proactive before the luck comes along so that you're ready for it, and then you have to take the chance and go with it once the opportunity arises, which sounds like exactly what happened to you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Though also there can be bad luck too, can't there? So we've got to be ready for the bad luck, and it's sort of how we deal with the bad luck and the good luck in life will determine a lot of how things turn out.
So that was another interesting, because you had some really cool passages from your diary that you included in the book. And so I was just curious about your discipline and motivation for keeping the journal while you were on the trip. Was it just for yourself? You thought maybe 10 years later, I'm going to want to read and see what my thoughts were at the time? Or was there any other? I tried to keep a diary when I was when I first left home and was traveling around Europe, and I think I wrote 30 pages or so, and it wasn't useful or good, and it wasn't something that I was able to keep up and do, which of course I do have some regret about now. But was journaling something that you did even before your trip, or was that just for that case?
Yeah, I think, as a sort of shy young person, I started keeping a diary, I guess, in my late teens properly, but it was always very internal. It was more my sort of inner torments, my inner struggles I'd write about a lot because I wasn't very good at talking to people about them. And that's continued all through my life. It's a processing tool where I talk a little bit about what's going on the outside, but I don't tend to do like big descriptions of things. Those bits in the book, they're not literally taken from the diary. They're reconstructed, put myself back in the present tense in that moment. So that's why those are not quite nicely written. But the diaries I did write on the expedition were very good memory prompts. So I had a mixture of photos, video footage, and quite a lot of diaries, which meant I could go back to those as I write. And I still do that for more recent expeditions. And it jogs your memory, so you really can put yourself back into that situation.
And so how was that process of writing the first book? I imagine it would be scary or feel like it's a huge, different kind of work that you're putting out there and sharing with the world. So how did that process go?
Yeah, it was really tough. Again, I had my usual, and it's very boring really to keep talking about it, but I had my usual self-doubt where I was like, I can't do this. I've got the book deal, which is so valuable to have a book deal because you've got a deadline, you've got a pressure. It's a bit like a university essay. You get on and do it. I got so much admiration for people who write a book before a book deal and then they try and get the book deal afterwards, because you've got to have so much more kind of self-motivation. So all that external motivation helped, lots of self-doubt. Again, maybe it's luck. I don't know if luck, Hemingway said, you need good luck to write well sometimes. And I had some good luck at the beginning of the book where I managed to write the first 10,000 words quite well, quite quickly. When it's the first thing the publisher asked me for before they gave me the book deal. I said, let's have 10,000 words. And I got off to a good start, which set the book up well. And it's so important to start a book when you get the right framing of the story. It really helps the rest of the book. And then I struggled a bit as I went along. I read quite a few books about how to write. I talked to a few friends, including my old friend Al, who's a writer as well. And they gave me some just little tips, which can really make a difference. I had some friends read the manuscript and give me feedback as I go along, which helps you, especially those really honest friends who tell you, like my friend Al is like very good at reading my books because he always just tells me when it's boring. He says, this entire chapter, which I just spent 2 months writing, it's boring. You can cut it down to one sentence. Okay, that's just 2 months. But actually, it makes the book a lot better when you do that. So I think that for me was very helpful. But I'll just grab a copy here. I didn't have huge expectations for it. I guess I had quite high standards because I like reading a lot. And I really don't like reading not very good books. I just think it's such a waste of time. How dare you put this book out in the world if you haven't really put your heart into it? And to be honest, I think there's far too many books out in the world at the moment, which are just written quite quickly. So anyway, I did the best I can. I wasn't really thinking whether it would be liked or not. But in the end, it actually got really good reviews. Like this guy from The Guardian, it's on the front. He said, I'm not sure Rob Lilwall knows it, but he's penned a two-wheeled classic, which I just was, and I think he could tell from the way the book was written that I didn't really know what sort of book I'd written. And I wasn't really trying that hard. But then he really liked it and lots of people liked it. So I still actually really love this book. I'm quite proud of it. My second book, I wasn't so keen on. It was a bit of a different story, the second book. But that first one was a bit of a, yeah, it was a real gift that it went so well.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I enjoy these type of books, travel and adventure books. Not sure if you've heard of one I read recently about an overland trip in Land Rovers from Singapore, also back to the UK. So I think
Okay.
you cross their paths some of the way. Of course, on a bike is a whole other story from driving in a vehicle, but that one was quite good. So yeah, I really enjoyed the book, and I look forward to reading the new one that's going to come out as well. So you finished the book, and did you go out and do publicity and start giving talks around that as well?
I think I was in the UK when the book came out, and then I just kept doing my school talks. So I'd always sell a few books at schools, and my publisher got me a few interviews on the media and in the newspapers and stuff. So I didn't push it heavily, and it wasn't like $1 million bestseller, but I think it sold like 40,000 copies, something, which is pretty respectable. A lot of books go out there and they sell. A lot of publishers are happy with 5,000 copies sold. So it's quite a low kind of standard of what you need to sell to break even. So I was very happy with how that went. And it's also had quite a long tail, this book. It still sells. So I think it's just sort of word of mouth. It kept selling. Even 20 years later, it still sells a bit. So
that's great. You mentioned how you, after the first expedition and coming back and getting the book deal and giving talks and having your video footage picked up by National Geographic, that it led you to this path of being a professional adventurer. But was there actually a point that you said to yourself, or someone said to you, okay, you should go be a professional adventurer now, or you already are a professional adventurer? Or was it more of a gradual step by step as you just kept going, kept putting one foot in front of the other, that all of a sudden you look back and you realize, oh, this is my career now. I'm doing this.
Yeah, more the latter. It wasn't, in a way, do I regret it? Maybe I slightly regret not being a bit more intentional and going all in. I was a bit like sort of part-time with it whilst doing other stuff. And it might have been better to go all in, who knows? But yeah, so there were other things going on in life. So just as I was finishing writing the book, during the bike trip, I'd met this girl when I was in Hong Kong as I was cycling home. And then we'd started dating long distance during the 2 more years I was on the bike after that. And then when I was just finishing the book, we got married. So that was a nice ending to the book. I married Christine, who I'd met on the bike trip. And so that was a big change in life in terms of just going off for years and years. So the sort of idea of going on off another really long thing was, I'd closed that door for myself, which I was happy with. But I was still just beginning to think, I should do some other adventures. And we moved back to Hong Kong, where Christine is from. And we ended up part-time, or she was full-time, I was part-time, running a charity here. So we would go it was a kids charity. We were really passionate about it, very involved in that. But then part-time, I was also thinking about what new adventure can I do to keep building this other career. I've got the adventure career. And so I planned this trip, and I saw it as a sequel when I came up with it. And I was probably thinking much too much along the lines of what will look good as a sequel, which is a really bad way to think about a journey. And it was I like the idea of trying to get home from somewhere distant, but this time instead of cycling, I'm going to walk. So I flew from Hong Kong to Mongolia, and then I tried to walk home. So the first trip was cycling home from Siberia. Second trip was walking home from Mongolia. And as I planned this trip, I suppose the moderate success I'd had from the first journey went to my head a little bit. And I was 33, 34, I think, when I was planning this. And there were a lot of little commercial opportunities that came up surrounding this journey. So I got a chance to do another TV show, which I managed to persuade Nat Geo to commission it before I went. I got another book deal. I had newspapers like the South China Morning Post said, can you write a weekly article for us? I had managed to get loads of sponsors for all my gear. I had radio interviews. I was trying to raise lots of money for the charity. And I basically said yes to everything. I was like, yes. And I went with this friend cameraman to Mongolia. And even the day we set off, we'd been delayed about 2 months because all the commercial stuff got a bit out of hand and took up all our time. We set off at the start of November when it was getting pretty cold in Mongolia. And I was so overwhelmed, even on day one, because I just had way too much stuff. I got so stressed out. Dealing with all these kind of commercial interests was very stressful. There was quite a lot of politics in these companies, which I was too naive and young to understand what was going on. And then the whole of that journey It was, on one level, it was a beautiful walk, 6 months walking through the Gobi Desert and through the middle of China, really cool route along the Great Wall, along the Yellow River. But on another level, it was like super stressful, dealing with all these different things. We had far too much to do. I wasn't spending enough time looking after myself. We were walking like 40 kilometers a day, filming for 2 hours a day. We had problems with our cameras. I got injured. It all just became super stressful and turned into this big slog. We had these like 25 kilogram rucksacks on. It was a journey where I learned how not to do a journey. And it was beautiful on one level. I love China. It's a fantastic place to go traveling. But on another level, it exacerbated my insecurities. I think that trip increased that sense of imposter syndrome that this journey had turned into such a difficult one. So it was a big lesson about don't try and do too many things on a journey. Do it for the right reasons and all these sort of things. Yeah. And then I did another book, another TV show. Wasn't as happy with either of those, but it was great for my overall career to do those. But it did take me a couple of years. I'd say after that trip, I felt really down after that trip because it just felt a bit of a crush to my confidence. And I'd expected the opposite from it. Yeah, it was a hard one.
Yeah. So even though you were able to complete the journey and you got everything published, just because of your own internal, how you went through the journey and how you executed it, you felt that it's disappointing or not what you would have wished it went like?
Yeah, I think I'd say on two levels. One was, and I talk about this in my speeches sometimes, talking about prioritization. I think the thing about prioritization is basically we often end up with way too many priorities, which basically means we don't have any priorities because we're trying to do too many things. And I had 10 different things I was trying to do on this journey, including a big walk, TV show, book, all these different things. And that meant, sometimes I say, if you have 10 priorities on your list, if you wrote down the top 10 things you want to achieve this year, would you prefer to have a B- for all 10 of those? Or would you prefer to have an A+ for the top 3? So if you have a choice, B- for 10 or A+ for 3. And more in life, I think it's better to get the A+ for 3. Do 3 things really well rather than 10 things like, okay. And so that's what happened with me. I ticked all the boxes, but none of them really I was proud of. So that was on one level. But on the deeper level, the sort of personal level, I think all that sort of insecurity I'd carried, I was one of those people who just carries this stuff quite heavily. It all got amplified by this journey. When I initially thought of the journey, I thought it was going to solve all of my kind of inner struggles. So yeah, it was tough. And after that, we went through various dramas going on in our lives, all kind of first world problems. But Christine had a big burnout from the charity she was working with, the charity we were helping. So I then had to take that over, which was super stressful. We were trying to have kids and turned out we were subfertile. So that was like super stressful and emotionally very hard. And we just felt a really dark season in life for those couple of years. And then, this is all ashamed in a way of how things happened, but this is how I dealt with it. I started thinking of doing another expedition. And I dreamt up this even crazier one, which was through this desert in Western China called the Taklamakan, it's not very well known in the world. It's interestingly unfamous because it's one of the biggest sand deserts in the world. In China, it's well known. It used to be called, in ancient times, it was called the Sea of Death. More the kind of colonial explorers called it the Abomination of Desolation. And sometimes it's translated as whoever goes in won't come out. So it's this like 1,000 kilometers of sort of deadly sand dunes. And I got this idea in my head. I'm going to try and walk across it alone. And again, in my sort of deepest part of me, and I wasn't even completely aware what was going on, but I think I just thought, if I can prove myself by being the first person ever to walk solo across this desert, because nobody ever done it solo before, if I can prove myself, that will solve all my problems. It will solve all this inner turmoil I'm feeling. It will solve my career worries. It will solve everything. And then when we were Christine's a very wonderful, supportive wife. She was supportive of this. She said, yeah, I see you need to do this. And I trust that you're not going to die. I trust your judgment on that. And then we got pregnant shortly before I was going to go, which is the best news possible. But probably all the ladies watching this are going to think you total science. But we decided with Christine's support, she said, I still think you need to do it. And I said, let's do it before the baby comes. So I went off and I did this mad expedition through this desert. Loads of things went wrong. It was a kind of really hard thing. I didn't actually end up calling it a success because I ended up having to walk along the edge of the desert for about 20%. So I couldn't call it a first solo crossing. But it turned into this amazing adventure, very hard, very scary at times. But somehow out of that process, it was actually one particular moment when I just had to detour from the middle of the desert to the edge because everything had gone wrong. I was going to have to walk along the edge for a bit, which meant I knew I wasn't going to get a record on this journey, which is what I'd originally hoped for. And I spoke to Christine on the phone. I said, you might as well just give up. It's all, I'm such a loser. And she said, look, every obstacle you faced on this journey, like flooded rivers, massive sand dunes, all these things that have gone wrong, every time you faced them, you've done your best. You've got back up and you've kept going. You got knocked down, you got back up, you kept going. So we can't control everything that happens in life. We can't always control everything and achieve what we originally wanted to achieve. All we can do is get back up every time we're knocked down and keep going and keep doing our best. And that's what you've been doing. So just keep doing that. Keep doing your best. Keep going. Find a way back in. You can finish this thing. And something just clicked. It's a bit like when you're in therapy and just suddenly the penny drops and you're like, oh yeah, it's not about the achievement. That's not what life's about. The achievements don't really matter. What it's about is when you get knocked down, you get back up and you keep doing your best. That's really what it's about. And it just clicked. And so for the rest of that journey, that was every day. It was like literally almost every, moment. I was just saying, just do your best. Don't worry when you get knocked down. Just get up, do your best, do your best. And I did that. And I managed to get back onto my original route, get to the end of the desert, lots of more crazy adventures. I couldn't call it like a pure crossing. I could call it a sort of crossing. But it was one of my favorite adventures. And strangely, I just felt psychologically very healed is all I can say. Like a lot of those demons, that imposter syndrome, it all got really healed on that journey. And so I came back from that journey and Christine said she could hear it in my voice. I came back quite a different person, much more at peace with myself, not completely. I've still got a few things to work through. And then about 6 weeks after that, we had our baby. And that's obviously started the next adventure, which has been the most wonderful thing. And then we had another baby. So I've got 2 babies. Anyway, so it was like that journey finally did what I needed all along, which was to deal with this sense of imposter syndrome and so on inside. But it wasn't through succeeding. It was through failing and getting back up. That was what did it for me, which is quite interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's one thing I've actually talked about before, that you need to focus on the journey and not the destination. And that's where you're going to get the most benefits and the most satisfaction. If you're only worried about where you're trying to get to your target or your goal, you miss everything that's going on along the way.
Yeah.
One thing that's interesting about that is, I think for your first adventure in the book, what sounded like one of the most fulfilling and interesting parts were all of the people that you met along the way. But that's very different when you're doing a solo expedition through the desert. So do you think that it was more the challenge of it that made feel so satisfied with it at the end, or what was that difference?
Yeah, I think it was the challenge it was much shorter. It was only 71 days compared to over 1,000 days on my first journey. But I think it was that intensity of facing like proper, real challenges, and failures and setbacks, and then getting up again and facing so much fear and getting through it again and again. So I think that was a big part of it on that latest journey. I think on the first journey, the cycling one where you read the book, I think you're right. The people I met was such a special thing, because when you go on a bike ride, it's amazing. And pretty much every country you go through, especially when you're traveling alone, actually, I think alone, you meet much more people than if you travel with others. So many people invited me in, whether it was like a weatherman in the middle of nowhere in Siberia, or some like pastor in some village in Korea, or some just factory workers in China. Everybody looked after me. And you have these amazing, sometimes you can't really talk because you don't speak the languages, but you have these amazing sort of nice experiences. And then sometimes you get invited in by English speakers, and people often really open up to you when you're this sort of nomadic dude passing through. Often they'll tell you their life story. And I was this quite shy 28-year-old or whatever on that bike trip. And it was a really great experience for just meeting some great people a bit older than me who'd really share their lives with me, and ask me about my life. And it was a very healing, that part of the bike journey was very special. Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah. It was a very sweet and romantic story about you meeting your wife, Christine, and how that all played out, which everybody should read the book to learn everything about it. Just a couple of final questions. If you can share, do you have Are you going to do any more expeditions, any plans, or are you satisfied with your adventures
Yeah,
so far?
great question. I think a few answers to that. One is, I think I am quite satisfied in terms of I don't feel like I need to prove anything anymore. So that I think was a driver on some of the earlier ones. I've now got kids who are now 8 and 4 years old. So my last expedition was eight years ago now. I got back from it. And that having kids, you've got kids, right?
Yeah,
You've got,
a 2.5-year-old.
That's it. Yeah, wonderful. Congratulations. Yeah. It really changes your risk profile. So you suddenly, as a dad, I'm sure as a mum too, but as a dad, I was just suddenly, I cannot die. I've got to be there for this person. In a very, even like when I cross the road, I look an extra time now because I'm like a real sense of responsibility. So that has changed my risk profile from being somebody who was living slightly on the edge to somebody who probably wouldn't do those sorts of adventures. All that said, I would love to do some more adventures. I've got a few ideas, which I'm not really making public at the moment, which are less dangerous, but they are scary in other ways, but not so life-threatening. Or family adventures. We've got an 8 and a 4-year-old. I just was in touch with a speaking client this week who's taking her, I think she's got 4 kids off on around the world, taking a career break for 4 years, for a year going around the world with 4 kids. So I'm like, wow, if you can do it with 4, maybe we can do it with 2. So maybe we'll do something, but we need to wait until they're a little bit older than they are. The 4-year-old's a bit young at the moment. So
that sounds like it'd be fun. And finally, I always like to ask my guests, if I talk to you again in 5 years and you're looking back at what's happened from now until then, what are some things for you personally, not necessarily about adventures, but what would be some things that you'd want to be able to tell me about that made you feel successful during the next 5 years?
Wow, that's such a good question, Nicholas. Because at the moment, I'm mainly speaking. I write books, but mainly I'm doing a lot. Last year, I did 47 speeches around the world, all these corporate events, which is how I met you. And that's going really well. So I'm doubling down on that for a while at the moment. I said to my father-in-law the other day, I feel like I'm in a golden cage where I've got this great product and I just go around doing it again. And he said to me, lots of people are in a cage and it's not golden, so stop complaining. I thought, I'm in a very sort of fortunate season in my career at the moment. But that said, if in 5 years I'm still doing this, maybe I'll say, hang on, life's not just about doing the thing because I'm a bit more in my comfort zone now, doing the thing where you can earn the most, where you can feel really successful. Sometimes you've got to get out of your comfort zone as a game. So I'd hope in 5 years, I will either be maybe about to get out of my comfort zone in some way, or I will have just got out of it. So I think you can come back to me in 5 years and ask me and see if I've passed that test.
That's a great answer and very in line with what you've done with your life. Thank you again so much for joining me today, Rob. It was great to speak to you. And everybody make sure where can people find you if they want to get your book, if they want to invite you to speak?
Yeah, just at my website, which is www.roblilwall.com, LILWALL.com.
Great. I definitely recommend picking up the book. And we had him speak last year at one of my events, and it was fantastic. Highly recommended for everybody. Thanks again, Rob. I'll talk to you again soon.
Great. Thanks so much, Nicholas.
Thank you for listening to Before We Get There with your host, Nicholas Braman. Please like and subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also find us on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook at Before We Get There Podcast. New episodes are released every other Thursday morning. See you next time.